Okay, so how many of you like recipes? Raise your hand. Okay, so a lot of you, some of you joined me for the horchata demonstration. And so today I want to be I'm going to talk about how our own charisms are our own recipe for acting in the world. Okay, so let's see. Here we have our little recipes that we're going to be talking about. So now we're going to get into the nitty gritty of what charisms are. But before that, I know that you were introduced to MCOR, and I know some of you have had experience with different personality tests or strength tests, and there are great uses of how they help us. And so the way that these tests can help us in our own spiritual practice is often they reflect our preferences in our spiritual practices. So let's say someone is on the Myers-Briggs, maybe a little bit more introverted. They're going to be drawn more towards maybe a contemplative practice. Not that there aren't extroverts who are contemplatives, but there's a higher likelihood, right? And how we gain also our energy from our spiritual journey is depending on our personality and our own strengths. And then how we take information in about the divine. So if we look at different learning styles, some of us might be a lot more auditory or visual or tactile. And so depending on that is the way that we receive the divine. Also, how we practice our faith in the divine, be it our mind or our heart. And how we live out our spirituality. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about a little bit today, since these are charisms are spiritual gifts. Okay, charisms or charism derives from the Greek word charisma, which means favor or gratuitous gift. It is a gift that we receive. And these are not talents, okay? We're not talking about something that we're really good at. This isn't something that's in our genetics that our parents passed down onto us. This is given to us by the Holy Spirit for us to then be able to use at the service of others. It's meant to be given away. So it's not for our own selfish gain so that I can earn X amount of money or for my career. No, this is something that's meant to be used at the service of others. And charisms are meant to be discerned and developed. And what's curious about charisms is that at different times and points in our life, we're going to use different ones. We may be using some here, some there, and we may even get some later in life as well. There are some readings in here. I included in the handout. I'm not going to get into them because we have a bit to cover today. But these are where the traditional charisms that I'm going to list in a little bit, where you can find them. That's Romans 12, 6-8, 1 Corinthians 12, Ephesians 4, 11-12. And you can certainly go in and read that during the time you're going to get today or during your free time to just discern a little bit more about what you feel your charisms are. Now, here are the ones that are listed within those scripture passages. So administration, celibacy. I'm going to go through just a little bit. Some of you may have already done this during your free time or even in your breakouts. There was a handout on Catholic charisms that was included in your packet. And so administration is these are folks who provide planning and coordination needed to accomplish God's work. Celibacy is fulfilled by remaining unmarried and celibate for the sake of Christ and to do other work. Craftsmanship, these are artistic and creative work that beautifies orders. The physical world as a channel of God. Lauren and I were talking about our love of fonts, and so I think that's part of our craftsmanship charism. Discernment of spirits perceives a divine or demonic presence in people or places or things. Encouragement empowers others through presence, words of comfort, encouragement, and counsel. Evangelism shares the faith with others that draws them to be disciples of Jesus. Faith, an unusual trust in the love, power, and provisions of God. Giving with exceptional generosity to those in need. Healing cures illness and restores health when healing, where healing is unlikely to occur quickly or to happen at all. Helps using old talents, charisms to help others serve God and people. Hospitality, warmly welcoming and caring for those in need of food, shelter, and friendship. Intercessory prayer, intense prayer for others so that God's love and assistance may reach those in need. Knowledge, diligent study and intellectual activity to better understand God, ourselves, and the universe. Leadership, shares a compelling vision of a better future with others and directs efforts of a group to make that vision a reality. Mercy, practical deeds of compassion to relieve distress to those that suffer and help them experience God's love. Missionary, effectively and joyfully using their charisms in a second culture. Music, writing or performing music for the delight of others and the praise of God. Pastoring, builds Christian community by nurturing and long-term spiritual growth. Prophecy, a channel of divine truth and wisdom by communicating a word or call of God's to individuals or to a group. Service, recognizing logistical gaps of unmet needs that prevent good things from happening and solving the problems. Teaching helps others learn information and skills to help them reach their full spiritual and personal potential. Voluntary poverty, lives a life of cheerful voluntary simplicity or poverty in order to identify with Jesus and the poor. Wisdom, remarkable insight that enables them to come up with creative solutions to specific problems. And last, writing, using words to create works of truth or beauty that reflect the fullness of the human experience and the glory of God. Now, I don't want you to limit yourself to these charisms. These are certainly the ones that we find within Scripture, but there's definitely, I like to talk about how the Spirit likes to break through our little boxes sometimes and presents us with new things, right? And so I'm going to give you some examples of different charisms that have popped up and in the format of recipes. But first, I want to talk a little bit about charisms of a religious community. Today we're here with the Bon Secours sisters and the young adults. And usually a charism of a religious community, it includes the vision, inspiration, or a unique characteristic that's in response to the inspiration of a founder. So the founder of Bon Secours, the founder of the Jesuits, the founders of the Dominicans, whoever it may be, usually the charism of a community is responding to an inspiration provided by a founder. And so that's usually where we hear the charisms. It's within the religious community, but it's also about us and our own spiritual gifts and how we use them. Just to give you a little bit of background, I know some of you are new to Bon Secours. I know I was new to Bon Secours as well. In French, it means good help. And their charism is lived out through the love of God to alleviate suffering by bringing all of creation to wholeness through compassion, healing, and liberation, especially to the poor, the sick, and the dying. I think it's important to note the history of the sisters who were founded there's a group of women who got together after the revolution. They were really concerned about folks who were in need, specifically the sick and the dying, and they wanted to ensure that they had a very good and spiritual death. At that time, the church was underground in Paris, and because of its association with the monarchy, and so they really wanted to accompany the sick and the dying in a spiritual way. And so their original charism was a charism of healing, but as you can see, they now have compassion, healing, and liberation as it's one charism, but it includes all those aspects that are more integral and whole. Am I capturing that correct, sisters? Sisters? Or Nick?
Good job. Good job,
Okay.
Patty.
Okay.
Absolutely,
Very
Patty.
good.
Okay. Now, I really love this chart that's included in your packet because what it does here in this packet, it includes the charism in the center. And then as you go out, you can see where they do this. They live out their charism in healthcare, human promotion, catechesis, and education. And then who is it that they serve? The oppressed, the sick, the dying, poor, the youth, families, women. And what is then the outcome? It's relief of suffering, wholeness, evangelization, human rights, and the dignity of each person. And so I really love the way it's displayed because it really is how they're living it out and with who they're living it out in the world, how they do that. You might want to, as you create your recipe too, a little bit later, maybe think a little bit about this circle as well and see it as an example of what you might see yourself doing. Now, our own personal charisms, I see them as a personal recipe for living in the world. Okay. I was sharing earlier today, you put in this much of water, this much, and sometimes you make adjustments based on what's happening, or if you have a dietary restriction, or you're sick, or whatever's happening, you adjust your recipes you to the times or what's going on in your life. And so we're gonna look at first some recipes of people in our own tradition and their own charisms and how they lived out in the world using their charisms. And I present these as recipes, but they're not exact science. I just made up the numbers. So just don't ask me, why did you use 2 cups here? I just made them up. They're just made up. So we're going to start off first with Saint Mary Magdalene. For those of you who do not know, she was not a prostitute. That's just something that was passed on in tradition for some reason. I'm not really sure why, but she was confused with another Mary or another woman in scripture, and she was not a prostitute, but she is known as the first evangelist. And so I list her first charism as evangelism. So I say 5 cups of evangelism because she was really the first one to go forth. We know that in the Gospel of John, Jesus appears to her, and he said, she calls to him and she says, "Teacher," and he says, "Don't cling to me," he says to her, and he instructs her to proclaim what he has seen. At this time, the men are locked up in a room, they're in fear, and she has to go out and proclaim what she has seen. So she has to go evangelize her brothers and other sisters who are locked up in fear. And so I put courage and faith in there together because I can only imagine what it must have been like to see someone who had died and then have been instructed by your teacher to then tell them that he is resurrected. And I think that took a great deal of courage and faith to go forward and do this. What's interesting is in Luke's interpretation or rendition of this, we see that it's Mary Magdalene and other women, and they inform the apostles. And the response from the apostles about the resurrection is, "But their story seems like nonsense, and they did not believe them." So I find that interesting that they're here they are sharing about the resurrection. She's evangelizing. She's got all this, taking all this courage and faith, and they don't believe her. And so I add this other one here of persistence. I think of a little half a cup of persistence. Nevertheless, she persisted. And because we know what happened with the gospel, right? We know that eventually the apostles came around and they too went forward to share the good news of the resurrection. So here I have this recipe here of charisms of Mary Magdalene, of evangelism, courage and faith, and persistence. We're going to move over to St. Clare of Assisi. She's one of my favorite saints. My spirituality is Franciscan. It's been in my family for ages, and I love Clare. And I chose her because, one, she shows us this life of celibacy, but it's an incredible story of going against the grain of what was expected of women of her time. Okay. Clare of Assisi was a noblewoman. She was very wealthy. She was educated. She actually was more educated than St. Francis of Assisi, could write much better than him. And so she would have heard Francis speak, because if you've ever been to Assisi, her house is located close to a square. You can actually see probably where she would have heard him preaching, and probably where he had this great fight with his father, where he took off all his clothes in public and renounced his father and basically said, "I'm going to live a simple life and take care of the poor." And so Clare wanted to follow in what wasn't a religious community back then. It was a movement. It was a movement of taking care of those in the peripheries, taking care of those in need, of the poor. And so um, she chose one night, after talking with Francis, she escaped her house because she was expected to get married, marry a wealthy person to bring in more wealth to her own family. And so she escapes, or she would have had to join a religious community. And what you need to know about religious communities back then is that the women brought the wealth into the convents often. And so they lived very comfortable lives, but she didn't want that. She wanted to follow in this new movement of sort of Francis and his simplicity. And so she runs off, and Francis joins Francis at what's called the Porciuncolo, which is outside of the outskirts of Assisi. And he cuts her hair off as a symbol of sort of this surrender to God and living a life of simplicity and celibacy, and just wanting to dedicate herself to God alone. So she chose this life of celibacy against, her parents' wishes, and also a life of poverty. She didn't want to own anything because she didn't want it to get in the way. She felt that everything that she received was a gift from God and was owned by God. And so she wanted to also imitate the simplicity and the poverty of Christ as well. And then I had a half a cup of contemplation. She was very much rooted in a very contemplative and what we call a silent prayer and meditation. She would often reflect on the image of Christ. And she would say, gaze into the mirror of Christ. And it was about gazing into a mirror to see Christ, but also Christ reflected in the other and in ourselves. And so what I love about this particular exercise that she does is a lot about self-love. And oftentimes I think we can be very hard on ourselves and be very critical about ourselves. We have this inner critic inside of ourselves. And she really wanted this exercise of contemplation to be one where we saw Christ in ourselves as well and reflected, and to be able to love that ourselves. So I love that piece of her and her contemplation. So this is her recipe of her charisms. We have St. Ignatius of Loyola. So St. Ignatius was, let me grab this quick here. He was the founder of the Jesuits. And so that took a great amount of leadership to be able to found a whole new community. Francis was not very good at leading communities, just so you know. He hated that piece of it. He hated the administrator. At some point, he got booted out. But St. Ignatius of Loyola was a great administrator and leader. And so he founded the Society of Jesus and was joined by 6 others who then vowed to live poverty and chastity. And so this is one of his great gifts. But I think the greatest gift that he gives us is his discernment. He was wounded in battle. He was supposed to be this great military person, and he was wounded in battle by a cannon that hit his leg, and he couldn't do much. And so he spent a lot of time in prayer, reflecting, and had this very dark night of the soul. And this is where he developed the spiritual exercises that I think I don't know, Chris, did you refer to the spiritual exercises? I couldn't remember if you did or not.
Yeah, I briefly mentioned the Ignatian discernment, but
And
yeah.
yeah, and so it's one of his greatest gifts in charism is this ability to discern how God is acting in our everyday life, and how we're called to then also a life of service, to really listen and discern where we're called to live out and serve. And we see that present. You mentioned also that you were part of the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, and so there is that aspect of the Jesuits of a life of service and justice. So that's sort of St. Ignatius' charism that we see reflected here. I wanted to maybe not pull from the saints as well. And the reason why is that sometimes the saints can feel a little bit unattainable to us. And like, oh, well, they were saints and I can't be like them. Or And so I wanted to draw from someone in my life who I really appreciate her charisms. And this is my Tia Maria. She was my great aunt, my grandmother's sister, and very important figure in my life for my own spirituality and just for my own. I'll talk a little bit about just her influence in my life and how her own charisms. I'm sure if I asked her, she would say that her charisms are something else. What you need to know about her is that she only had a fifth grade education in Mexico and then immigrated and married, had children, and she lived next door to me here in San Diego for a, the majority of my childhood and adolescence, and I would often go over to her house and visit her, and so she was very important to my life. Um, I'd say 3 teaspoons of hospitality, because every time I went to her home, she was offering me food. I'm sure you have a relative who's like that. That when you go over, you cannot say no, and it was almost an insult to say no. You had to accept, even if you had already eaten, and even if she had already given me like 5 things, she still wanted to give me more. And I always just remember her, always for sure, if I was at her place, there was ice cream, and she was going to give me a bowl of ice cream. So I really appreciated this gift of hospitality that she provided me. 2.5 cups of seeing beauty. Um, One of the things about my great aunt is, she any person that walked in the door, and myself, when she saw you, she would say, "Oh, look at you! You're so beautiful," or you're so handsome." And it became a running joke between my sister and I when friends would come over and we would warn them, she's going to tell you that you're really beautiful, but she says that to everybody, so don't let it go to your head. And so we would have a good laugh about it. But the truth is that she really believed it. And you left her home with a full stomach and feeling wonderful and beautiful. And that to me was a beautiful gift that she shared with everyone that she came across. And the other one was a tablespoon of encouragement. She was always encouraging me. And, when I told her that when I was involved in church, I was kind of a little weird. I was the only one in my family that was really, since I was 17, I was teaching as a catechist, and my family thought I was a little strange. And, but she loved it and she encouraged me. And when I went to study theology for grad school, she would write me letters, and there were just these beautiful letters of encouragement and support. She couldn't offer much financially, but her letters meant a great deal. I really look forward to her letters while I was away and I was homesick. She provided so much encouragement to me. So I think that was her charism of supporting me in that way. So I provided you, obviously I gave you the list of what the charisms are, but what I want you to think about is I want you to take a few minutes to review the handout on charisms, and I want you to discern what you feel are the gifts that the Holy Spirit has bestowed upon you right now, because that can change. It can change in a couple months. It can change in a couple years. Trust me. Um, and so I want you to just think about what are these charisms, and don't stick just to the ones on the list. You might think about it and say, I think that God really gave me this particular gift. It's not on the list, but I think this is a gift that I have that is at the service of others. Just remember that these gifts are there to serve and enhance others. So I want you to think about that. And what you're going to do is you're going to take a few minutes, maybe about 15 minutes and a bit, to think about it. And then you're going to go look in your little packet. You have this recipe card. You're going to write your name because this is your charism recipe. You're going to write your ingredients. Your ingredients can be more than 3. It doesn't just have to be 3 charisms. It could be 4, 5, 6, 7. You could have 10 charisms for all I know. And so write them down and come up with your own measurements of what you think they are. Like, this is what I'm really using right now, or right now it's just a teaspoon of this one. And then you want to write the directions, which the directions are how do you use them or how you plan to use them in the world and put them at the service of others. Very similar to kind of what the sisters of Bon Secours, they had the way that they were impacting the world. I want you to think about that and write your own recipe. So take about 15, maybe 20 minutes to do that. And then we're going to go into breakout groups for you to share your recipe with others, because sometimes as you're listening to others, you're like, oh, you know what? I didn't ever thought about that. That's kind of I think that's my charism too. Or it might make you think of something else. Okay, so we're going to take that time to do that. And then I'm looking forward to, because then we're going to come back in the group and I want to hear a little bit from you what your recipes are. How does that sound? Sound good? Okay. So you can, you could either stay on camera or you could turn it off, go find a quiet space, take about 15 minutes. So let's come back around, let's take 20 minutes to do that. So let's come back do you think 20 minutes okay, Nick, or should we do 15 so then they can do breakouts for 15 and 5
Why
minutes?
don't we do that? 15 and 15.
15. Okay, let's do that. Lauren, how'd you like my fonts? So actually, Nick, we don't need to record because they're going straight in. All right, well, welcome back. Is everybody back now? Looks like we are. Okay, so I would love to hear from a few of you. I know it'll probably be our extroverts who will do this, or who knows, maybe an introvert they just really want to share their recipe. But I would love to hear, your recipe and your directions if you want to share them with everyone. Any volunteers? Any volunteers?
I will. Your introvert friend will jump in and be first.
Awesome.
I'm Caitlin. So I put down for mine 2 cups of hospitality, a cup of music, 2 cups of encouragement, and 3 tablespoons of seeking out the good in others. So less traditional one at the end there. But for hospitality, just creating a warm environment for people is really important to me, and giving them what they need versus what I think they need, and just helping them to feel loved in my presence. So that's what hospitality is for me. And then music, I'm a music minister. So that's a really wonderful way for me to pray, and for me to help other people pray and experience the mystical quality of worship that I think is really just like the secret sauce a lot of times, honestly. And then encouragement. I definitely find myself in a situation often where people come to me for counsel. And when I don't know what the answer is, or if I'm not sure, I will often pray to the Holy Spirit in that moment and ask what it is that this person needs to hear. And sometimes in my life that's edged into feeling slightly prophetic in those moments. Sometimes it can be really intense. But then the little bit of seeking good in others is just, it's something that I try to do as a practice in general, because everyone is made in the image and likeness of God. And so I try to honor that as much and as often as I can. So that's my little bit.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. All right. Who wants to share next?
I'll be happy to,
Awesome.
Sister Fran. Yep.
Right.
I'm just going to read what I wrote, and I really appreciated it. And I think I didn't put any amounts of anything, because maybe I've just the place and the age I am in my life, it's hard to separate out. I used to try to see, what was my strongest gift? What was the greatest gift God gave me? And now it's all like sort of flows, all fits. So, but my ingredients are hospitality, flexibility, humor, openness, adaptability, seeing God in all things, forgiveness, understanding, and fidelity. And my directions are to measure liberally with an extra dose of humor and adaptability. Taste to make sure it's not too sweet, not too bitter, not stale, but fresh. Shake together and reshake each time before using. Add the ingredients as needed to meet the needs of those coming to the table. Always have some leftover as starter dough. And don't worry about it being perfect. Just make sure it's always available for those who need it.
Oh, that's so beautiful. It made me want to cry. That's great.
I love doing it. And I have to tell you, Patty, when you first invited us to do it, I thought, I don't have a clue. And all of a sudden I just started to write. And I really thank you so much for that opportunity. Really, really mean it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Someone else that would like to share?
Sure, I'll go. So as I told my small group, I jumped deep into the baking metaphor. So just as a little bit of a preface to this, I have 4 cups of caregiving, 1 cup of craftsmanship, half a cup of encouragement, 2 tablespoons of littleness, and 1 tablespoon of surrender. And the gist of the recipe is to mix together the caregiving and the encouragement into a pie crust as the structure for what I'm doing and kind of the base around it. And then to mix together the craftsmanship, littleness, and surrender into sort of a pie filling, if you will, and bake it all together so that it is one cohesive recipe, one cohesive bite, but there's definitely kind of different parts that are playing off of one another and working together to serve different parts of me and different parts of my community and my vocations all at once.
Nice.
Wonderful. All right. Someone else who would like to share?
I can go. I can share mine. Hi, I'm Vicky. Yeah, the measurements don't matter because they changed kind of daily, but that was fun. 2 cups of spiritual motherhood, 1 cup of leadership, 1 cup writing, 1 quart faith, 2 tablespoons of hospitality, 2 tablespoons of encouragement, and 1.5 tablespoons of therapeutic listening. So for my directions, I have use spiritual motherhood to care and love for all in a nurturing way. Add leadership in the places I've been planted to love the community. Write to touch the hearts of others and to pray. Send enough cards to bring joy. Trust in God and live the gospel. Care for others with the warmth of hospitality and encourage those in need of hope. Heal through therapeutic listening to calm anxieties and to allow others to be healed.
Beautiful. Wonderful. I love how each of the recipes reflects your own gifts, but also your personalities. I can really see that coming through, and I love that. So, anyone else who would like to share? I want to hear a gentleman share. That would be nice. I want to hear a male recipe. Who's gonna share?
Patty, I can share, even though I wasn't in a group, because I
Okay.
love to cook. So I had a half a cup of faith, 2 tablespoons words of wisdom, 3 teaspoons of giving, and a cup of leadership. And so you start by mixing giving into the faith, slowly until it flows from you at a steady stream. And then sprinkle words of wisdom until it starts to thicken. And then let that sit for about an hour and until you have a good sense. And then when that's done, slowly fold in leadership until it forms that desired consistency.
Oh, that's really good.
Thanks.
I know we were chatting about how you really enjoyed it, so that was kind of cool to see because I know you love to cook. We were talking about that earlier in the day and your bacon. We were talking about bacon earlier today, and we were talking about lobster during the break.
Yes. Well, what's great about this exercise, and I really appreciate it, I don't know what other people thought, it's just the fact that it's a writing exercise, but it's a chance to sort of make these words, right, turn into actions, right? And that's kind of the beauty, is that charisms can look like just words, but they're these these gifts, as you mentioned, to give and to receive. So I appreciated this this exercise.
Yeah, and what's great about this is that we often change recipes. Like, okay, so I was talking about how I'm a vegetarian, and it's a choice that I made as a young adult and early in my life, 20 years ago, um, and so I'm Mexican, and so our food includes a lot of meat. So I've had to adapt a lot of my mom's and my grandmother's recipes to my own diet today. So what I want you to think about is that although you've written this today, is that this can change. You can keep editing it because at some point in your life you can receive another charism, or you might shift the way you view your recipe and what you're doing and who you're sharing it with. So keep this recipe with you somewhere, and then as you go along in life, you can go along and edit it and maybe add or change up your directions. Okay. Anyone else who would like to share? It's going to be our last one before I let Lauren wrap up with any announcements.
I can go.
Evelyn?
I am. So mine, I didn't measure like with cups, but I just wrote the words. I said I need the ingredients of faith, hope, charity, missionary courage, simplicity, patient, joyful, and generous. And I didn't forget the prayer. So the direction, I said, in order to be a good or great missionary, I need the ingredient of faith, hope, and charity, because I have to believe that God has called me to serve others. In hope and charity, that they will feel His love towards them through my service. Like these people will feel God's love, which He has towards them, and it will be through my service. I also said that I have to exercise patience, because being patient is really necessary for a missionary. And also I have to be a prayerful person. I have to be simple and courageous in all that I do.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Last chance to share. Anyone? Last chance? Okay, so I think we're going to wrap up. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for sharing. That's my favorite part of this, is actually listening to the recipes and to your creativity too, as you write, especially the directions. To me is part of my favorite part of it. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to pass it on now to Lauren, who might have some wrap up stuff and some announcements to make. But thank you, everyone.